Dr. Elena Reyes froze in disbelief as a wild, pregnant bobcat slipped through the ICU doors and made a deliberate path to her comatose patient's bedside, its amber eyes filled with unmistakable purpose. When the animal's first labor contraction rippled across its swollen belly, Elena knew she was witnessing something that would break every medical protocol and leave the entire hospital in tears. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The night shift at Mercy General Hospital's intensive care unit was usually quiet, but something about this evening felt different. Dr. Elena Reyes had been on duty for nearly 14 hours, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, the weight of too many consecutive shifts evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. The ICU had been operating at full capacity for weeks, a silent testament to the growing population of Oak Ridge and the hospital administration's reluctance to expand the facility. But tonight, there was an unusual stillness in the air, as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Elena stood at the nurse's station, reviewing patient charts when the first reports came through. Security had detected movement in the hospital's East Wing garden, something larger than the usual raccoons or possums that occasionally ventured onto the property. The cameras had captured only glimpses, a tawny coat, spotted and sleek, moving with deliberate purpose toward the building. Probably just a stray dog, Nurse Michael Chen suggested, not looking up from his computer screen. At 32, Michael had seen enough in his 8 years at Mercy General to remain unfazed by most disturbances. Elena nodded absently, her attention already returning to her patients. Room 4 held Thomas Whitaker, a retired forest ranger who had suffered a massive heart attack 3 days earlier. His condition had stabilized, but at 72, with a history of cardiac problems, his prognosis remained guarded. In room 6, Lily Sanderson, just 19, was recovering from a near-fatal car accident that had left her in a coma for the past week. The remaining rooms held similar stories, lives hanging in the balance, families waiting in anguished anticipation for news both dreaded and hoped for. The security alert was quickly forgotten as Elena made her rounds, checking vitals and adjusting medications with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dedicated her life to healing. She had just finished examining Thomas when Michael's voice came urgently over the intercom. "Dr. Reyes, I need you at the nurse's station. Now." Something in his tone made Elena move quickly. When she reached the station, Michael was standing perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the ICU's main entrance. Through the glass doors, Elena could see what had captured his attention. A bobcat, its spotted coat unmistakable, was sitting in the corridor just outside the unit. "How did it get in?" Elena whispered, as if the animal might understand her words. "No idea," Michael replied, reaching slowly for the phone. "But I'm calling animal control." Elena raised her hand, stopping him. There was something strange about the bobcat's behavior. It wasn't pacing or acting agitated as a wild animal trapped in a building might. Instead, it sat perfectly still, its golden eyes fixed on the ICU doors with an intelligence that seemed almost deliberate. "Wait," she said. "Look at her belly." Michael glanced again and his eyes widened. The bobcat was heavily pregnant, her sides swollen with the promise of new life. As they watched, she rose gracefully to her feet and approached the glass doors, placing one paw against the surface as if testing its resistance. "We need to secure the patients," Elena said, shifting into crisis management mode. "Lock down all the rooms and make sure everyone knows not to open these doors." Before Michael could respond, the overhead paging system crackled to life. "Code yellow, East Wing, ground floor. Code yellow, East Wing, ground floor." The hospital's code for an animal intrusion. Security would be mobilizing, but they were minutes away. What happened next defied explanation. The bobcat stepped back from the doors, and with a grace that belied her pregnant state, leapt upward, catching the edge of the door handle with her paw. The door, left unlocked in violation of hospital protocol, swung open just enough for the animal to squeeze through. "My God," Michael breathed, reaching for the emergency alarm. "Don't," Elena said sharply. "You'll scare her, and a frightened wild animal is dangerous." The Bobcat entered the ICU with measured steps, ignoring the two humans at the nurse's station. Her eyes scanned the room, moving from door to door as if searching for something specific. The night shift staff, two other nurses and an orderly, froze in place, uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented intrusion. Elena's medical training battled with her instinctive fear. The Bobcat was clearly on a mission, but what could possibly have drawn a wild, pregnant predator into a hospital, and more specifically, into the ICU? The animal paused outside Thomas Whitaker's room, sniffing the air. Then, with the same deliberate movement that had opened the outer doors, she rose on her hind legs and pawed at the handle. "She's trying to get into his room," Michael whispered in disbelief. Elena's mind raced. Thomas Whitaker, former forest ranger. Could there be a connection? Before she could formulate a theory, the Bobcat abandoned Thomas's door and moved down the corridor, stopping outside Lily Sanderson's room. "Everyone stay completely still," Elena instructed the staff in a low, calm voice. "No sudden movements. Nurse Wilson, call security and tell them to bring wildlife specialists. No guns, no tranquilizers. We need someone who knows how to handle this without violence." As Nurse Wilson reached slowly for the phone, the Bobcat turned, fixing Elena with a stare that sent shivers down her spine. There was something in those amber eyes, an urgency, a desperation that transcended species. The animal then did something that would later be described as miraculous in the local news. She walked directly to room 8, the room occupied by Dr. Samuel Rivera, the hospital's beloved chief surgeon who had suffered a stroke while performing an emergency operation 3 weeks earlier. Samuel had been Elena's mentor, a brilliant doctor who had dedicated 40 years to Mercy General. His condition had been deteriorating steadily, and the staff had been taking turns sitting with him, unwilling to let him face his final journey alone. The Bobcat pawed at Samuel's door with increasing urgency, emitting a low, keening sound that was neither growl nor purr. Elena felt a strange certainty form in her mind. This animal needed to enter that room. "Dr. Reyes, you can't possibly be considering," Michael began. "I am," Elena interrupted. "And I know it sounds crazy, but I think we need to let her in." Let a wild Bobcat into a critically ill patient's room? That's not just crazy. It's grounds for termination, possibly criminal charges. Elena's gaze remained fixed on the Bobcat. "Look at her, Michael. Really look. This isn't random. She came here for a reason, directly to this hospital, this unit, this room." As if understanding Elena's words, the Bobcat turned those intelligent eyes toward her, and for a moment, doctor and animal regarded each other with mutual assessment. Then the Bobcat did something extraordinary. She sat down, perfectly still, as if waiting for permission. The ICU had fallen completely silent. Even the usual beeping of monitors seemed muted, as if the machines themselves were holding their breath. Elena made her decision, guided by something beyond medical training, something that resonated in the deeper, more instinctive part of her brain. "I'm going to open the door," she announced. "Everyone stay back." "Elena, don't," Michael began, but she was already moving. As she approached, the Bobcat remained still, watching her with those unnerving amber eyes. When Elena reached for the door handle, the animal backed away slightly, giving her space. With a deep breath, Elena pushed the door open, stepping aside. The Bobcat entered Samuel's room with the dignity of a visiting dignitary, her movements careful and precise. Elena followed, aware that she was potentially sacrificing her career, but driven by an inexplicable certainty that this was the right course of action. Samuel lay still on the hospital bed, his once vibrant face now slack and gray. The monitors showed the weak, erratic heartbeat that had been gradually fading over the past few days. The Bobcat approached the bed, sniffing the air around Samuel's hand that hung slightly over the edge. Then, with infinite gentleness, the Bobcat pressed her forehead against Samuel's fingers. The monitor registered the change immediately. Samuel's heartbeat strengthened, finding a more regular rhythm. His oxygen levels, which had been declining for days, began to rise. Elena stood transfixed, her medical mind struggling to process what her eyes were witnessing. The Bobcat settled on the floor beside the bed, pressing her body against the metal frame, and began to purr. The sound filled the room, deep and resonant, a vibration that seemed to penetrate the very air. And as the sound continued, Samuel Rivera, who had not shown any response to stimuli for over a week, opened his eyes. "Samuel," Elena whispered, medical protocol forgotten as she rushed to his side. His eyes, clouded with confusion, struggled to focus on her face. "What?" His voice was a dry rasp, hardly recognizable as the confident baritone that had guided countless surgeries. "Don't try to talk," Elena said, checking his vitals with trembling hands. "You've been unconscious for over a week." Samuel's gaze drifted from Elena to the Bobcat still purring contentedly on the floor. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by something Elena could only describe as wonder. "She found me," he murmured. Before Elena could question this cryptic statement, Michael burst into the room, followed by 2 security guards. Their abrupt entrance startled the Bobcat, who rose to her feet with surprising agility despite her pregnancy, a low growl rumbling in her throat. "Everyone stop," Elena commanded, positioning herself between the animal and the newcomers. "Back out slowly. She's not aggressive unless threatened." "Dr. Reyes," one of the guards began, "we have protocols. And I have a patient who was comatose 2 minutes ago and is now conscious," Elena interrupted. "A patient, I might add, who seems to know this animal. So unless you want to explain to the board why you interfered with a medical miracle, I suggest you give us some space." The authority in her voice was enough to make the men hesitate. Michael, his medical curiosity overriding his caution, studied Samuel with disbelief. "His readings are stabilizing," he confirmed, checking the monitors. "This is impossible." The Bobcat, sensing the tension had eased, returned to her position by Samuel's bed. The purring resumed, filling the room with its rhythmic vibration. "Not impossible," Samuel whispered, his voice growing stronger with each word. "She's Artemis." "You know this animal?" Elena asked, her mind struggling to reconcile the concept of a former forest ranger recognizing a wild bobcat by name. Samuel managed a weak nod. "Rescued her. As a cub. Released her. 2 years ago." Each phrase seemed to drain his energy, but his eyes remained clear, fixed on the Bobcat with undisguised affection. The security guards exchanged skeptical glances, but remained in the doorway, unwilling to contradict a doctor who had just witnessed what appeared to be a miraculous recovery. "Samuel," Elena said gently, "you're saying this specific Bobcat is one you rehabilitated years ago, and she somehow found you here, in this hospital?" "Wildlife rehabilitation was my hobby," Samuel explained, his breathing labored but steady. "Before the forests were my patients. Artemis was special, always different." Elena remembered then, conversations in the doctor's lounge, Samuel showing photos of the animals he worked with on weekends, his passion for wildlife conservation that rivaled his dedication to human medicine. She had never made the connection that Thomas Whitaker, the former forest ranger in room 4, might have known Samuel through this work. "But how did she find you?" Michael asked, his skepticism giving way to fascination. And why now? Samuel's gaze returned to the Bobcat, to Artemis, with a look of such profound understanding that Elena felt like an intruder witnessing something deeply personal. "Animals know," he said simply, "better than we do." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, if not for the timely arrival of Dr. Marcus Jensen, the hospital's wildlife consultant. In a facility surrounded by national forest, animal incidents were common enough to warrant having a specialist on call. Marcus entered the already crowded room with the confident ease of someone accustomed to unusual situations. "Well," he said, surveying the scene with professional interest, "when security called about a bobcat in the ICU, I assumed it was a prank." The bobcat, Artemis, regarded the newcomer with cautious assessment but continued her vigilant position beside Samuel's bed. "Dr. Jensen," Elena began, "this is apparently Artemis, a bobcat that Dr. Rivera rehabilitated and released years ago. She somehow found her way to his room, and when she did..." Elena gestured to the monitors displaying Samuel's improved vital signs. Marcus crouched to observe the animal from a respectful distance, his expression thoughtful. "Female, approximately 4 years old and very pregnant," he noted. "Probably carrying 3 or 4 cubs, judging by her size, and remarkably calm for a wild animal in this environment." "She's not wild," Samuel said, his voice stronger now. "Not entirely. Imprinted on humans. Too young when found." Marcus nodded. "That explains her comfort around people, but not how she found you, Dr. Rivera. Bobcats have excellent senses, but navigating a hospital?" "The real question," Michael interjected, "is what we do now. We can't keep a wild animal in the ICU, imprinted or not." Elena saw Samuel's hand move slightly toward the bobcat, his fingers just brushing her fur. The animal responded by intensifying her purr, the vibration visibly traveling up Samuel's arm. The monitor showed his heart rate settling into an even stronger rhythm. "There's something happening here that we don't understand," Elena said quietly. "Something medical science can't explain. Dr. Rivera was declining rapidly before Artemis arrived. Now look at him." Marcus studied the monitors, then the unusual pair, the frail human doctor and the pregnant bobcat maintaining their inexplicable connection. "There have been studies," he said thoughtfully, "on the therapeutic effects of animal vibrations, particularly purring, on human tissue. Frequencies between 25 and 100 Hz can promote healing, reduce inflammation, even strengthen bone density. But the research is preliminary, nothing conclusive." "I don't need research papers to see what's happening right in front of me," Elena insisted. "She's helping him." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Hospital Administrator Patricia Gomez had arrived, her face set in lines of professional concern that barely masked her fury. "Would someone please explain why there are reports of a wild animal loose in my ICU?" she demanded, then stopped short at the threshold, taking in the bizarre tableau before her. Elena stepped forward, her voice steady despite the absurdity of the situation. "Ms. Gomez, I can explain. This is Artemis, a bobcat with a prior connection to Dr. Rivera. Her presence has somehow facilitated a remarkable improvement in his condition." Patricia's expression shifted from anger to disbelief. "You expect me to believe that a bobcat walked into our hospital and miraculously healed a stroke patient?" "I don't have an explanation," Elena admitted, "but I have results." She gestured to the monitors. Dr. Rivera was non-responsive for over a week with declining brain function. Now he's conscious and communicating. Patricia's gaze moved from Elena to Samuel, who was now sitting slightly more upright in his bed, his eyes clear and focused in a way they hadn't been even before his stroke. "Samuel," she asked, her professional demeanor cracking slightly, They had worked together for nearly 2 decades, rising through the hospital ranks as allies and occasional rivals. "It's me, Patty," he confirmed, using the nickname only he was permitted to use. "And before you call animal control, you should know that Artemis is here because I need her, and judging by her condition, she needs me too." The pregnant Bobcat, as if understanding she was the subject of discussion, rose and stretched before settling into a more comfortable position, her swollen belly now prominently visible to everyone in the room. "She's about to give birth," Marcus observed. "Probably within the next 48 hours, based on her behavior." Patricia Gomez closed her eyes briefly as if praying for patience or possibly divine intervention. When she opened them, she had the resigned expression of an administrator who knew when she was facing a losing battle. 24 hours, she said firmly. "You have 24 hours to figure this out. I want wildlife experts, veterinarians, and legal consultants in my office first thing in the morning. And this stays absolutely quiet. No social media, no press. The last thing we need is to become known as the hospital that allows wild animals in the ICU." As Patricia left to manage damage control, Elena exchanged glances with Michael. They both knew that containing this story was impossible. Already the night shift staff were whispering among themselves, and by morning, the tale of the Bobcat who had somehow known exactly where to find her former caretaker would be spreading throughout the hospital. What none of them could have predicted was how much more extraordinary the story would become before dawn. As midnight approached, the news of the pregnant Bobcat in the ICU spread through Mercy General like wildfire, despite Patricia Gomez's attempts at containment. Hospital staff found increasingly creative reasons to pass by Samuel's room, hoping for a glimpse of the extraordinary visitor. Elena, recognizing the need for crowd control, stationed Michael at the door with strict instructions to allow entry only to essential medical personnel. "This isn't a zoo exhibit," she reminded a group of curious radiology technicians who had wandered up from the basement. "Dr. Rivera needs rest and Artemis needs space." Inside the room, Samuel's condition continued to improve in ways that defied medical explanation. His speech had become clearer. The paralysis that had affected his left side was noticeably diminishing, and the foggy confusion that typically accompanied post-stroke recovery was almost entirely absent. Through it all, Artemis maintained her position beside his bed, occasionally shifting to accommodate her pregnant belly, but never breaking contact with the frame of the hospital bed. Dr. Marcus Jensen had remained, his professional interest in the Bobcat evolving into something more complex as he witnessed the inexplicable bond between animal and patient. He sat quietly in the corner of the room, taking notes and occasionally consulting veterinary references on his tablet. "Her behavior is unprecedented," he murmured, more to himself than to Elena. "Bobcats are solitary by nature, especially females preparing to give birth. They seek isolation, security. For her to choose a hospital, the noise, the smells, the people, it contradicts everything we know about wildlife behavior." Elena checked Samuel's latest readings, marking them in his chart with a precision that belied her exhaustion. "Maybe what we know isn't everything there is to know," she suggested. Samuel, who had been drifting in and out of sleep, opened his eyes at this exchange. "Artemis was always different," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Found her beside her mother's body on Highway 23. Just a tiny thing, eyes barely open. The mother had been hit by a car, but somehow the kitten survived." Elena pulled up a chair beside his bed, sensing that Samuel needed to tell this story. "You took her in?" He nodded, a small smile lifting the corners of his mouth. "Illegal, technically. Should have turned her over to Fish and Wildlife. But the rehabilitation centers were overwhelmed that season. Forest fires had displaced so many animals. She wouldn't have received the care she needed. So you became her surrogate parent," Elena surmised. "For 18 months, Samuel confirmed. Fed her with a dropper at first, then taught her to hunt. Built a special enclosure on my property. I tried to minimize human contact, keep her wild, but..." He paused, his eyes finding the bobcat, who now raised her head as if responding to the story of her own life. There was always something about her eyes, an awareness that went beyond animal instinct. Marcus leaned forward, intrigued. "When you released her, did she stay near your property?" Samuel shook his head. "No, she did exactly what she was supposed to do. Disappeared into the forest. I tracked her with a wildlife collar for 6 months before the signal went dead. That was 2 years ago. I thought I'd never see her again." "Yet here she is," Elena said softly, "pregnant and seemingly determined to find you specifically." Before Samuel could respond, Artemis suddenly rose, her body tensing. A low, urgent sound emerged from her throat. Not quite a growl, not quite a cry. "What's happening?" Elena asked, alarm rising in her voice. Marcus moved closer, his experienced eyes assessing the bobcat's posture. "I think she's having contractions. Early labor." He turned to Elena, his expression serious. "We need to prepare for the possibility that she'll deliver here, in this room." Elena's medical training immediately kicked in, though her experience with laboring mothers had never included a wild feline. "What do we need?" "Clean towels, warm water, a quiet environment," Marcus listed. "And someone who knows bobcat obstetrics, which fortunately isn't too different from domestic cats." He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling Sophia Carter. She's the head veterinarian at the wildlife sanctuary just outside town. If anyone can help with this, it's her." As Marcus stepped into the hallway to make his call, Elena turned to Samuel, whose face reflected both concern and wonder. "This wasn't what you expected when you woke up today, was it?" she asked, attempting to lighten the tension. Samuel's laugh was weak but genuine. "Elena, I didn't expect to wake up at all. According to my own prognosis, I should be dead by now." His gaze returned to Artemis, who had settled again, though her breathing remained more rapid than before. "Whatever brought her here, whatever connection allowed her to find me, I'm grateful for it." The door opened, and Michael entered with an older man Elena didn't recognize. The stranger was in his 70s with weathered skin and clear blue eyes that suggested a lifetime spent outdoors. He moved with the deliberate care of someone managing chronic pain, but his gaze was sharp and alert. "Dr. Reyes," Michael said, "this is Thomas Whitaker, the patient from room 4. Elena's surprise must have shown on her face because Thomas offered a sheepish smile. "I'm not supposed to be out of bed," he admitted, "but when I heard the rumors about Samuel and a bobcat, well, I had to see for myself." Samuel's face lit up with recognition. "Thomas, my God, what are you doing here?" "Heart attack," Thomas replied matter-of-factly. "Seems retirement doesn't agree with me." His attention shifted to Artemis, and his expression softened with professional appreciation. "So this is your girl, the one you wouldn't stop talking about when we were working on the conservation committee." "You know about Artemis?" Elena asked. Thomas nodded, carefully lowering himself into the chair Elena had vacated. "Samuel and I worked together on several wildlife projects before I retired from the Forestry Service. He mentioned a special case, a bobcat cub he was rehabilitating, said she was the most intelligent wild animal he'd ever encountered." Artemis watched Thomas with the same careful assessment she had given everyone who entered the room, but without the wariness she had shown toward the security guards. Something in the old ranger's presence seemed to reassure her. "She's beautiful," Thomas said softly. "And quite far along, I see." Samuel nodded. "Marcus thinks she's in early labor." "Not just early labor," came a new voice from the doorway. A woman in her 40s with cropped salt and pepper hair and the confident demeanor of someone used to managing crises stepped into the room. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt under an unzipped jacket, clearly having dressed hastily. Based on what Marcus described, she's probably been in labor for several hours already. "Dr. Carter, I presume?" Elena asked. "Sophia, please," the woman replied, setting down a large medical bag. Her eyes quickly assessed the scene with professional efficiency. "Marcus briefed me on the situation. Extraordinary, to say the least." She approached Artemis slowly, speaking in a low, calming voice. "Hello, beautiful. Looks like you've had quite a journey." To Elena's surprise, Artemis allowed Sophia to come closer than she had permitted anyone except Samuel. The veterinarian knelt beside the Bobcat, not touching her, but studying her condition with experienced eyes. "She's definitely in active labor," Sophia confirmed. "I'd estimate she'll deliver within the next 2 to 3 hours. She looked up at Elena. "Is there any way to clear this room a bit? Too many people will stress her." Elena nodded, making quick decisions. "Michael, please take Mr. Whitaker back to his room, with a wheelchair this time. Dr. Jensen can stay to assist you, and I'll remain to monitor Dr. Rivera." Michael helped Thomas to his feet, the older man clearly reluctant to leave. "I'd like to know what happens," he said to Samuel. "This is, well, it's a once-in-a-lifetime thing, isn't it?" "I'll keep you updated," Samuel promised. "And Thomas, thank you for coming." As the room cleared, Sophia began unpacking her bag, laying out instruments and supplies with methodical precision. "I've assisted with wildlife births before," she explained to Elena, "but never in a hospital ICU. This is definitely a first." Elena helped adjust Samuel's bed to give him a better view while still maintaining a distance that wouldn't interfere with the birth. "Today seems to be a day for firsts," she said, checking his vitals one more time. "Your recovery defies every medical expectation. And now this." Samuel reached for her hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. "Stay with me?" he asked, and Elena heard the vulnerability beneath the request. Despite his improving condition, he was still a patient facing an emotional event that no medical textbook could have prepared either of them for. "Of course," she promised, pulling up another chair. "I wouldn't miss this for anything." Outside, the night deepened toward that peculiar stillness that comes in the hours before dawn. The hospital corridors grew quiet as the initial excitement about the Bobcat visitors settled into a watchful anticipation. News had spread beyond the ICU, and throughout Mercy General, staff members spoke in hushed tones about the strange miracle unfolding on the 3rd floor. In room 8, time seemed to move at its own pace. Sophia Carter had transformed a corner of the hospital room into an impromptu wildlife birthing station, with towels, warm water, and specialized equipment from her medical bag arranged within easy reach. Marcus Jensen assisted her, their professional rapport evident in their minimal, efficient communication. "She's remarkably calm," Sophia observed, keeping a respectful distance from Artemis, who had created a nest-like depression in the blanket Samuel had insisted be placed on the floor beside his bed. Wild bobcats typically become aggressive during labor, especially around humans. "She doesn't see us as threats," Samuel said, his voice steady despite his obvious fatigue. "She came here deliberately, seeking safety." Elena checked Samuel's monitors again, noting with continued amazement the steady improvement in his vitals. His blood pressure had stabilized, his oxygen saturation was near perfect, and his neurological responses showed none of the deficits typical of a severe stroke. If she hadn't known his medical history, she would never have believed he had been at death's door just hours earlier. "Samuel," she said quietly, careful not to disturb Artemis, "I need to ask you something that might sound strange." He turned to her, his eyes, once clouded with illness, now clear and attentive. "After everything that's happened tonight, I doubt anything could sound strange." Did you dream about her? About Artemis? During your coma? Samuel's expression shifted, surprise giving way to thoughtful consideration. How did you know? Just a hunch, Elena said, though it was more than that. An intuition born of years watching patients navigate the mysterious borderland between life and death. What did you dream? I was lost in a forest, Samuel began, his voice taking on a distant quality. Everything was dark, foggy. I couldn't find my way out, couldn't call for help. But then I heard purring, that same purring Artemis used to make when she was a cub. I followed the sound and... He paused, looking almost embarrassed. It sounds ridiculous now. No, Elena encouraged him. Please go on. The purring led me to a clearing in the forest. Artemis was there, but larger than life, her eyes glowing like amber lanterns. She kept calling to me, telling me to follow her home. Samuel glanced at the Bobcat, who was now panting softly through another contraction. When I woke up and saw her here, I wasn't even surprised. It was as if some part of me had been expecting her. Before Elena could respond, Sophia motioned for their attention. It's starting, she said quietly. The first kit is crowning. Artemis had positioned herself in the classic birthing posture of wild felines, her body tense with effort. The room fell completely silent except for the soft, rhythmic beeping of Samuel's heart monitor, which seemed to accelerate slightly in synchronization with the Bobcat's labor. What followed was a testament to nature's efficiency. With minimal distress and remarkable composure, Artemis delivered her first kit, a tiny, wet bundle of spotted fur that appeared almost impossibly small. The mother immediately began cleaning the newborn with methodical licks, stimulating its breathing and circulation. It's a female, Sophia whispered, her professional detachment momentarily broken by wonder. And perfectly formed from what I can see. The kit, once dry, revealed a coat pattern remarkably similar to her mother's, tawny fur with distinct rosettes, though darker overall. Her eyes were tightly shut, her miniature paws kneading instinctively at the air as she sought her mother's warmth. Healthy weight, good coloration, Marcus noted, keeping careful records on a small pad. Approximately 280 grams. Elena found herself holding her breath, the medical professional in her momentarily overwhelmed by the simple miracle of birth. Beside her, Samuel watched with an expression of such profound joy that it transformed his face, erasing the lines of illness and age. I never thought I'd see this, he murmured. When I released her, I hoped she would thrive, find a mate, continue her line, but to actually witness it. Artemis barely rested before the second round of contractions began. This labor was slightly longer, the Bobcat's breathing becoming more labored as she worked to deliver her second offspring. Sophia moved closer, her experienced eyes watching for any signs of distress. Should we help her? Elena asked, her medical instincts responding to the animal's evident pain. Not yet, Sophia cautioned. She's managing well. An intervention could cause more stress than assistance. As if determined to prove her capability, Artemis gave a final push, and the second kit emerged, slightly smaller than the first, with a distinctive white patch on its forehead. Male, Marcus confirmed as Artemis began the cleaning process again, also appears healthy. Samuel's monitor showed a slight irregularity, prompting Elena to check his condition more closely. To her surprise, he wasn't showing signs of distress, but rather of intense, empathetic connection. His breathing had synchronized with Artemis's, his heart rate following the pattern of her exertions. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. He nodded, unable to take his eyes off the unfolding scene. "I can feel what she's feeling," he said so softly that Elena nearly missed it. Not the pain exactly, but the purpose, the necessity of this struggle. The third birth came more quickly, as if Artemis had found her rhythm. Another female kit joined her siblings, slightly smaller but equally vigorous in her first moments of life. Artemis gathered her 3 offspring close to her body, creating a protective circle around them as they instinctively sought nourishment. 3 healthy kits, Sophia announced, satisfaction evident in her voice. 2 females and 1 male. Perfect litter size for a first-time mother. Is she finished? Elena asked, noting that Artemis still seemed uncomfortable, shifting position despite her obvious exhaustion. Sophia frowned slightly, watching the bobcat's continued restlessness. She should be. 3 is typical for a bobcat's first litter. But, as if in answer to the unspoken question, Artemis tensed again, her body contracting with renewed effort. This labor was different, more strained, more urgent. The bobcat's eyes, which had remained half-closed through the previous births, now opened fully, fixing on Samuel with an intensity that sent a chill through the room. "Something's wrong," Marcus said, moving closer despite the risk. "This doesn't look normal." Samuel suddenly reached out his hand toward Artemis, his gesture automatic and unthinking. "She's asking for help," he said with absolute certainty. Sophia hesitated only briefly before making her decision. "The 4th kit may be malpositioned. I need to examine her." She turned to Elena. "I'll need your assistance. She trusts you by association with Dr. Rivera." Elena moved to Sophia's side, medical training overriding any hesitation about approaching a wild animal in distress. To her amazement, Artemis remained calm as they approached, her amber eyes never leaving Samuel's face. "Talk to her," Elena suggested to Samuel. "Keep her focused on you while we help." Samuel began speaking in a low, steady voice, not just random reassurances, but specific memories of their shared past. "Remember the creek behind my cabin, Artemis? How you would watch the fish for hours before making your move? And the old oak tree you learned to climb, where you'd sit and survey your domain like a queen?" As he spoke, Sophia carefully examined the laboring bobcat, her experienced hands gentle but thorough. "The kit is turned sideways," she confirmed. "I'll need to adjust its position manually." What followed was one of the most extraordinary examples of cross-species cooperation Elena had ever witnessed. Artemis, seemingly understanding the necessity of the intervention, remained still while Sophia worked to reposition the 4th kit. Samuel continued his soft monologue of shared memories, his voice becoming a lifeline that the bobcat clung to through her pain. "Almost there," Sophia murmured, her face tight with concentration. "Just a little adjustment and..." With one final expert manipulation, Sophia corrected the kit's position. Artemis gave a powerful push, and the 4th kit emerged, noticeably smaller than its siblings, and alarmingly still. "It's not breathing," Sophia said, her professional calm masking the urgency of the situation. Without hesitation, she cleared the tiny airway and began gentle resuscitation efforts, her fingers carefully stimulating the newborn's chest in a miniature version of CPR. Elena watched, transfixed by the delicacy of the procedure. The kit was impossibly small, fitting easily in the palm of Sophia's hand, its wet fur revealing a unique pattern. Unlike its siblings, this one was almost entirely dark, with only a few golden spots scattered across its back. Samuel's monitors suddenly showed a concerning drop in heart rate and blood pressure. Elena turned to him in alarm, but his attention remained fixed on the struggling kit, his eyes never leaving the tiny form in Sophia's hands. "Samuel?" Elena moved to his side, checking his vitals. "Your pressure's dropping." "Save the kit," he whispered, his voice strained but determined. "Please." Sophia continued her efforts, but after nearly a minute with no response, her expression began to reflect defeat. "I'm sorry," she began. "Don't stop," Samuel insisted, his voice stronger despite his weakening vitals. She didn't bring them here to lose one. What happened next defied medical explanation. Samuel, who had been too weak to stand just hours earlier, pushed himself upright in his bed and extended his hands. "Let me," he said with an authority that brooked no argument. Sophia hesitated only briefly before placing the motionless kit in Samuel's palms. The contact was electric. Samuel's monitors immediately registered a surge in his vital signs, as if some energy was flowing from him into the tiny creature. "Come on, little one," he murmured, gently stroking the kit's back with one finger. "Your mother came too far for you to give up now." For several agonizing seconds, nothing changed. Then, as if responding to some unheard command, the kit gave a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch. Another followed, stronger this time, and then miraculously, its miniature chest began to rise and fall with shallow breaths. "It's working," Marcus whispered, his scientific skepticism momentarily forgotten in the face of what could only be described as a miracle. The kit's breathing strengthened, and suddenly it opened its mouth in a silent mew, its tiny paws kneading at the air. Samuel's face transformed with joy, tears streaming unashamedly down his cheeks. "It's a fighter," he said softly, "just like her mother." "Female," Sophia confirmed, her own voice thick with emotion. "The smallest of the litter, but she's definitely alive." Artemis had been watching intently, her amber eyes fixed on her fourth offspring. When the kit began moving with more vigor, the bobcat made a soft chirping sound, a mother's call to her young. Samuel carefully lowered his hands to the nest of blankets, allowing the revived kit to join her siblings. Artemis immediately began cleaning her smallest daughter, her rough tongue stimulating circulation and removing the remaining birth fluids. The kit responded with increasing strength, eventually finding her way to nurse alongside her siblings. "I've never seen anything like that," Sophia said quietly, watching the family with professional wonder. By all medical standards, that kit should have been lost. Samuel leaned back against his pillows, suddenly exhausted, but with a peace in his expression that had been absent since his stroke. "Life finds a way," he said simply. Elena checked his vitals again, finding them remarkably stabilized despite the exertion. "You should rest now," she advised, adjusting his IV. "You've had more excitement than any stroke patient should." He smiled weakly. "Worth it," he murmured, his eyes already drifting closed with exhaustion. As Samuel dozed, Elena stepped aside with Sophia and Marcus to discuss the next steps. Dawn was approaching, and with it would come the full day shift of hospital staff and Patricia Gomez's deadline for resolving the situation. "The kits can't be moved for at least 24 hours, Sophia explained. "They're too vulnerable right now, and disturbing the bonding process could be detrimental to their development." "Ms. Gomez isn't going to like that," Elena said, glancing at her watch. "She gave us until morning to figure this out." Marcus frowned thoughtfully. "What if we could offer a compromise? Some kind of controlled environment that would keep both the hospital administration and the animals' needs in balance?" Their discussion was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Michael peered in, his expression a mixture of apology and resignation. "Dr. Reyes, there's a situation developing in the lobby." "What kind of situation?" Elena asked, immediately tensing. "Someone on the night shift posted about the Bobcat on social media," Michael explained. "It's gone viral. There are reporters gathering downstairs, and Patricia Gomez is on her way in. She's not happy." Elena closed her eyes briefly, gathering her composure. "How many reporters?" "At least 3 news vans already, with more arriving. The stories hit the local stations. Miracle at Mercy General, wild bobcat gives birth in ICU. They're calling it a feel-good piece, but Gomez is concerned about regulatory violations, potential liability." "I'll handle Patricia," Elena decided. "Sophia, can you stay with Artemis and the kits? Marcus, I need you to prepare documentation explaining the medical necessity of keeping them undisturbed for now." As Elena prepared to face the hospital administrator, Samuel stirred, blinking awake with surprising alertness. "The reporters," he said, though no one had mentioned them within his hearing. "They're going to want a story." Elena approached his bedside. "Don't worry about that now. Just focus on resting." Samuel shook his head slightly. "No, listen. This could be important, not just for Artemis and her kits, but for the wildlife conservation project Thomas and I were working on before my stroke. The public attention could generate the funding and support we need." Elena was struck by the clarity of his thinking, another sign of his inexplicable recovery. "What project?" "A protected corridor connecting the national forest to the state conservation land," Samuel explained. "Development has been fragmenting the habitat, isolating wildlife populations. We were losing momentum when I got sick." He glanced at Artemis, peacefully nursing her kits. "But people respond to stories like this. They connect with individual animals in ways they never would with abstract conservation policies." The door opened again, and Patricia Gomez entered, her usual impeccable appearance somewhat diminished by having been called in at 5 a.m. Her expression softened slightly at the sight of the Bobcat family, but her professional concern quickly reasserted itself. "Dr. Reyes," she began, her voice carefully controlled. "I believe I was clear about the timeline for resolving this situation." "Ms. Gomez," Elena replied, gesturing toward the Bobcat and her nursing kits. "As you can see, the situation has evolved. Artemis has delivered 4 kits, the youngest of which required emergency intervention. According to Dr. Carter, moving them now would put their survival at risk." Patricia's gaze moved from the Bobcat family to Samuel, noting with surprise his improved condition. "Dr. Rivera, you're awake, and remarkably better, from what I can see." "Thanks to Artemis," Samuel said simply. "She found me when I was lost." Patricia's expression suggested she wasn't prepared to attribute medical miracles to wildlife intervention, but she couldn't deny the evidence before her eyes. "The board is convening an emergency meeting in 1 hour. The hospital's legal team is concerned about potential violations of health codes, not to mention the liability issues if anyone were to be injured." "No one's going to be injured," Samuel insisted. "Artemis chose to come here, chose to trust us." "With all due respect, Dr. Rivera, she's a wild animal regardless of your past connection. We have protocols for a reason." As they spoke, the smallest kit finished nursing and began to explore, her tiny legs still unsteady. With determined movements, she separated from her siblings and wobbled toward the edge of the nest. Artemis watched attentively, but made no move to retrieve her adventurous daughter. To everyone's astonishment, the kit continued her determined journey across the floor, her destination unmistakable: Patricia Gomez's sensible shoes. Patricia froze as the tiny creature reached her foot and attempted to climb onto her shoe, emitting a barely audible mewing sound. For a moment, the hospital administrator's professional facade cracked completely, revealing the simple human response to such innocent vulnerability. Patricia Gomez, who had faced down board members, irate surgeons, and budget crises without flinching, found herself completely disarmed by the tiny creature attempting to scale her shoe. Without conscious thought, she knelt down, bringing herself closer to the kit's level. "She's chosen you," Samuel said softly from his bed. "They say bobcats are excellent judges of character." Patricia glanced up, momentarily abandoning her professional reserve. Is the little one okay? She seems so much smaller than the others." "She's a fighter," Sophia replied, moving slowly to Patricia's side. "We almost lost her during the birth, but she pulled through. Dr. Rivera helped save her." The tiny kit, having succeeded in capturing the hospital administrator's attention, sat back on her haunches and released another barely audible mew. The sound seemed to resonate in the quiet room, a perfect distillation of innocence and determination. "May I?" Patricia asked, extending her finger toward the kit with unexpected gentleness. Sophia nodded. "Just let her approach you. Don't try to pick her up." The kit sniffed Patricia's finger with evident curiosity, then pressed her tiny head against it in a gesture that even the most hardened bureaucrat couldn't resist. Something shifted in Patricia's expression, a softening that transformed her entire demeanor. "I had a cat when I was a girl," she said unexpectedly, her voice carrying a warmth Elena had never heard before. "A stray that showed up at our door during a snowstorm. My father wanted to take it to the shelter, but I begged to keep her." A small smile touched her lips. "She lived for 17 years. Best decision I ever made." The moment of vulnerability passed quickly as Patricia straightened, professional responsibility reasserting itself. But when she spoke again, her tone had changed subtly. "The situation downstairs is becoming untenable," she said, addressing Elena directly. "We need a coordinated response. The press is calling this a miracle. The Bobcat who knew exactly where to find her former caretaker, giving birth in the ICU while he makes a remarkable recovery." "It is rather miraculous," Marcus offered carefully. Patricia gave him a measured look. "Miracle or not, we have a hospital to run. We can't have the ICU turned into a wildlife exhibit." She paused, looking back at the tiny kit who had settled contentedly beside her shoe. "However, I recognize the unique circumstances we're dealing with." Elena sensed an opening. What if we could turn this into an opportunity rather than a crisis? Dr. Rivera was just explaining a conservation project he and Thomas Whitaker were developing before his stroke, a wildlife corridor connecting protected lands. Samuel nodded, sitting up straighter in his bed. The Wildwood Corridor Project. It would create a protected passage for wildlife between the national forest and state conservation areas, preventing the isolation of animal populations as development encroaches on their territories. Patricia's administrative mind was already calculating possibilities. Public relations value, community engagement, potential donor interest. She turned to Samuel. "You believe this story, your story with Artemis, could generate support for the project?" "I know it could," Samuel said with quiet conviction. "People connect with individual animals far more readily than with abstract conservation concepts. Artemis and her kits could become ambassadors for all the wildlife that would benefit from the corridor." The smallest kit had begun exploring again, wobbling back toward her mother and siblings. Artemis watched attentively, making a soft chirping sound that guided her daughter home. The three other kits were now more active as well, their tiny bodies wriggling as they grew accustomed to the world outside the womb. Patricia observed the family for a moment longer before coming to a decision. "Here's what we're going to do. Dr. Reyes, contact our media relations team and have them prepare a statement. We'll hold a brief press conference, controlled access, limited questions, explaining the situation. Dr. Jensen, work with Dr. Carter to prepare documentation on the medical necessity of maintaining the Bobcat family in place temporarily." She turned to Samuel, her expression professionally neutral but with a new undercurrent of respect. "Dr. Rivera, if you're feeling up to it, your perspective would be valuable at the press conference. Your medical recovery alongside this unusual visitation makes for a compelling narrative." Samuel nodded, surprising Elena with his evident strength. Just 12 hours earlier, he had been non-responsive, his prognosis bleak. Now he was sitting up, engaged, his mind clearly functioning at full capacity. "I'd be happy to participate," he agreed, "though I think we should include Thomas Whitaker as well. He brings the Forestry Service perspective, and his involvement would lend additional credibility to the Wildwood Corridor project. Patricia considered this, then nodded. I'll have his attending physician evaluate whether he's stable enough to participate. She checked her watch. We'll schedule the press conference for 10 a.m. That gives us 4 hours to prepare. As Patricia left to begin coordination with the hospital's public relations team, Elena turned to Samuel with undisguised amazement. You just convinced Patricia Gomez, the woman who once refused to approve extra pudding cups for the pediatric ward, to hold a press conference featuring a wild bobcat in the ICU. Samuel smiled, a hint of his old mischief returning to his eyes. Patricia has always been practical. She recognizes an opportunity when she sees one. Michael, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped forward. Dr. Reyes, you should see what's happening online. The story has gone beyond local news. National outlets are picking it up. Mercy Bobcat is trending, and people are already making donations to the hospital's foundation, asking that the funds be directed toward wildlife conservation. Elena checked her phone, scrolling through the flood of notifications. The story had indeed captured public imagination, with social media users sharing the limited photos and information available, often embellishing with their own interpretations. Some posts claimed Artemis had traveled hundreds of miles to find Samuel. Others suggested she had been guided by spiritual forces. While the details varied, the emotional core remained consistent. People were moved by the bond between human and animal, by the mystery of how Artemis had found her way to Samuel in his time of need. We need to get ahead of this, Elena decided. Provide accurate information before the story becomes completely distorted. Sophia, who had been monitoring the Bobcat family with professional attention, looked up. I can contact my colleagues at the Wildlife Sanctuary. They could provide educational context about bobcats, correct misconceptions, and offer expertise on the conservation aspects. Perfect, Elena agreed. And we'll need to prepare this room for the media visit. Create some kind of barrier that will protect Artemis and the kits while allowing limited visibility. As they discussed logistics, Samuel's attention drifted back to Artemis. The bobcat was watching him with those intelligent amber eyes, her body curled protectively around her kits, but her gaze unwavering in its focus on him. Once again, he felt that inexplicable connection, the same one that had pulled him back from the borderlands of consciousness when all medical science had suggested he was beyond reach. Thank you, he whispered, too softly for the others to hear. Artemis blinked slowly in response, a gesture that feline behaviorists recognize as one of trust and affection. In that moment, Samuel understood something that would be difficult to articulate at the upcoming press conference, something beyond the realm of scientific explanation. Artemis had not simply found him by chance or even by memory of their past connection. Something deeper, more profound had guided her. The same mysterious force that had allowed him to revive her struggling kit with nothing but his touch and his will. These thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a team of nurses coming to prepare him for the press conference. As they checked his vitals and helped him into a fresh hospital gown, Samuel felt a surge of purpose that had been absent in the months before his stroke. Whatever mysterious second chance he had been granted, he intended to use it well. By 9 o'clock, Mercy General had transformed. The hospital's small conference room, typically used for board meetings and staff trainings, had been hastily converted into a media center. Hospital maintenance staff had set up rows of chairs facing a table where Patricia Gomez would lead the press conference. Behind the table, a large monitor was prepared to display a live video feed from Samuel's room, allowing the press to see Artemis and her kits without disturbing them directly. Thomas Whitaker had been cleared by his physician to participate, though with strict limitations on his exertion. The retired forest ranger sat in his wheelchair in Samuel's room, his weathered face animated with more energy than he'd shown since his admission. "Never thought I'd be doing a press conference from a hospital bed," he chuckled, adjusting the oxygen cannula in his nose, "much less about a bobcat breaking into the ICU." "She didn't break in," Samuel corrected with a smile. "She was invited. We just didn't know it yet." Elena supervised the technical setup, ensuring the camera angle would show Artemis and her kits while maintaining a respectful distance. The bobcat seemed remarkably unfazed by the activity, watching with alert interest but showing no signs of stress. The kits, now dry and more active, were beginning to explore their immediate surroundings, their tiny spotted bodies wriggling with the uncoordinated movements of newborns. "How are you feeling?" Elena asked Samuel, checking his vitals one final time before the broadcast began. His improvement continued to defy medical explanation. His neurological function was nearly normal, his speech clear and coherent, his left side mobility returning steadily. "Like I've been given a second chance," he replied, his eyes finding the smallest kit, who had once again separated from her siblings to explore farther afield. "One I don't intend to waste." At precisely 10 o'clock, Patricia Gomez stepped to the microphone in the conference room, her professional demeanor firmly in place. The room was filled beyond capacity, with reporters from local stations mingling with representatives from national news organizations and even a few international correspondents. "Good morning," Patricia began. "I'm Patricia Gomez, Chief Administrator of Mercy General Hospital. Thank you for joining us today to discuss what can only be described as an extraordinary series of events that began in our intensive care unit last night." She outlined the basics of the situation: a pregnant bobcat somehow entering the hospital, finding her way to Samuel's room, delivering 4 healthy kits, and the apparent connection to Samuel's remarkable recovery. Her tone remained measured and clinical, but even Patricia couldn't entirely suppress the wonder in her voice as she described the sequence of events. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Elena Reyes, ICU physician, who was present throughout these events. Elena stepped forward, acutely aware of the cameras recording her every word. At approximately 11:42 p.m. last night, a female bobcat, later identified as Artemis, entered our ICU and proceeded directly to the room of Dr. Samuel Rivera, who had been in a declining state following a severe stroke 3 weeks ago. What followed defies conventional medical explanation. She described Samuel's sudden improvement upon Artemis's arrival, the bobcat's delivery, and the dramatic resuscitation of the 4th kit. Throughout her account, Elena maintained her professional composure, but her genuine amazement shone through. We are now conducting a live feed from Dr. Rivera's room, where he is joined by Thomas Whitaker, a retired Forestry Service ranger who has worked with Dr. Rivera on wildlife conservation projects. The monitor behind them flickered to life, showing Samuel sitting upright in his hospital bed, Thomas beside him in his wheelchair, and Artemis visible in her makeshift nest with the kits. The assembled press let out a collective gasp at the sight, followed by the rapid clicking of cameras. "Good morning," Samuel greeted them, his voice strong and clear, a stark contrast to the nearly terminal patient he had been just 24 hours earlier. "I'm Dr. Samuel Rivera. Before my stroke, I divided my time between surgery at this hospital and wildlife rehabilitation at my property, adjacent to the National Forest. Artemis was one of my patients, a bobcat cub I raised and released about 2 years ago." He explained his history with Artemis, providing context for their unusual bond. As he spoke, the smallest kit once again ventured away from the nest, moving toward the camera with curious determination. "That's the 4th kit," Samuel explained, his expression softening. "She nearly didn't make it, but she's proving to be quite the explorer." A reporter called out from the conference room, "Dr. Rivera, Do you attribute your recovery to the Bobcat's presence? Are you claiming some sort of miraculous healing? Samuel considered this carefully before responding. As a medical professional, I'm hesitant to use terms like miracle. What I can say with certainty is that my condition began to improve immediately upon Artemis's arrival and has continued to progress at a rate that my colleagues find unusual. Thomas Whitaker leaned forward in his wheelchair. If I may add something, I've spent 50 years observing wildlife, and I've never witnessed anything like the bond between Samuel and this bobcat. There are aspects of nature that science is only beginning to understand. Another reporter raised her hand. Can you explain how the bobcat found you in the hospital? How did she get in? Security footage shows her entering through a garden door that had been propped open by a staff member taking a break, Samuel explained. As for how she found me specifically, he paused, glancing at Artemis. I can't explain that. She traveled over 15 miles from my property, navigated a complex building, and located me in a specific room. Draw your own conclusions. Patricia Gomez smoothly redirected the conversation. While this extraordinary event has captured public attention, Dr. Rivera and Mr. Whitaker would like to highlight its broader significance for wildlife conservation. Thomas took this cue to introduce the Wildwood Corridor project, explaining how development was creating isolated pockets of habitat that threatened wildlife populations. Animals like Artemis need connected territories to thrive. Our project aims to create protected pathways between existing conservation lands. As he spoke, the camera caught a remarkable image. The smallest kit had made her way to Samuel's bed and was attempting to climb the hanging sheet. Without disrupting his conversation, Samuel gently lowered his hand, allowing the kit to clamber onto his palm. He carefully lifted her into view of the camera, her tiny face and bright eyes creating an immediate sensation among the watching press. This little one doesn't have a name yet, Samuel said, his voice softening. But she represents the future we're trying to protect, not just for bobcats, but for all the species that share our increasingly fragmented world. The image, a recovering stroke patient holding a newborn bobcat while its mother watched with apparent trust, immediately went viral. Social media platforms exploded with screenshots, the hashtags #DarMercyBobcat and Wildwood Corridor trending nationally within minutes. Patricia fielded questions about hospital protocols and the plan for Artemis and her kits with practiced efficiency. We are working with wildlife experts to create temporary appropriate accommodations until the kits are stable enough to be moved. Dr. Rivera's room has been converted to meet both his medical needs and the requirements of the bobcat family. When asked about potential violations of health regulations, Patricia's response was uncharacteristically philosophical. There are moments when rigid adherence to protocol must yield to exceptional circumstances. This is one of those moments. We are taking all necessary precautions to ensure patient safety while respecting the remarkable nature of this situation. The press conference continued for nearly an hour, with questions ranging from scientific inquiries about bobcat behavior to more spiritual interpretations of the events. Throughout it all, Samuel maintained a balanced perspective, neither dismissing the mysterious aspects of Artemis's appearance nor making extravagant claims about supernatural intervention. Sometimes, he said in response to a particularly probing question about his recovery, we encounter events that exist at the boundary of our understanding. Whether you see this as divine intervention, the unexplored potential of cross-species connection, or simply a remarkable coincidence depends on your perspective. What matters is what we do with such moments when they occur. By mid-afternoon, the story of Artemis and her kits had transcended local interest to become a national phenomenon. Major networks dispatched correspondents to Oak Ridge, social media feeds filled with images of the Bobcat family, and donations to the hastily established Wildwood Corridor Fund exceeded $100,000 within hours of the press conference. In Samuel's room, the atmosphere had settled into a strange new normal. Hospital administration had approved temporary modifications, installing a specialized barrier that allowed observation while protecting both the Bobcat family and hospital staff, adjusting the lighting to more closely mimic natural conditions, and implementing strict protocols for the limited personnel authorized to enter. Elena, completing her third consecutive shift with only brief rest periods, reviewed the latest set of Samuel's test results with mounting amazement. His brain scans showed dramatic improvement in areas previously damaged by the stroke. His blood work indicated decreasing inflammation, and his physical therapy assessment revealed motor function that should have taken months of rehabilitation to achieve. "Your recovery doesn't make medical sense," she admitted, setting aside his chart. "I've consulted with 3 neurologists, and none of them can explain it." Samuel smiled, watching Artemis grooming her kits with methodical attention. Perhaps that's because the explanation lies outside conventional medicine. "You mean something spiritual?" Elena asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. "Not necessarily." Samuel shifted in his bed, his movements more fluid than should have been possible so soon after a severe stroke. "Throughout human history, we've repeatedly discovered that the boundaries of science are not fixed. They expand as our understanding grows. What seems miraculous in one era becomes comprehensible in the next." From his wheelchair positioned near the window, Thomas Whitaker nodded in agreement. Despite his doctor's orders to return to his own room for rest, the retired ranger had remained unwilling to miss any developments with Artemis and her kits. His own recovery seemed buoyed by the excitement. His color improved and his energy noticeably increased. "I've seen things in the forest that science can't yet explain," Thomas offered. "Communication between trees through fungal networks, animals displaying awareness that defies our understanding of their cognitive abilities." He gestured toward Artemis. "The natural world operates by rules we've only begun to comprehend." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Michael entered, carrying a tablet displaying a video call interface. "Dr. Reyes, the Wildlife Sanctuary Director, is on the line to discuss arrangements for Artemis and the kits." Elena took the tablet, greeting the woman whose face appeared on screen. "Dr. Abigail Morrison, director of the Blue Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary, had been consulting remotely throughout the day, providing guidance on the Bobcat family's care." "Dr. Reyes, I've reviewed the footage and photos you sent," Abigail began, her expression reflecting professional fascination. "The kits appear remarkably healthy, especially considering the circumstances of their birth. However, I have concerns about their eventual transition to an appropriate environment." "What kind of concerns?" Elena asked, angling the tablet so Samuel and Thomas could participate in the conversation. "Typically, Bobcat kits remain with their mother for about 9 months, learning essential survival skills before independence. These kits were born in a hospital environment with significant human presence. Their developmental imprinting could be affected." Samuel leaned forward. "Dr. Morrison, I successfully rehabilitated and released Artemis after she imprinted on me as a cub. I believe with proper protocols, we can manage this situation without compromising the kit's wild nature." Abigail's expression remained skeptical. "Dr. Rivera, with all due respect, Artemis's current behavior, seeking you out, delivering her kits in a human environment, allowing human handling, suggests her rehabilitation wasn't entirely successful in terms of wild behavioral patterns." An uncomfortable silence followed this assessment. Elena glanced at Samuel, expecting defensiveness, but instead found thoughtful consideration on his face. "You may be right," he admitted after a moment. "Perhaps Artemis exists in a unique space between wild and domesticated, not fully either, but something else entirely. The question becomes, Is that necessarily a failure? The smallest Kit, who had been exploring the perimeter of the barrier, chose that moment to attempt climbing it, her tiny claws scrabbling against the smooth surface. The effort proved too ambitious, and she tumbled backward in a graceless somersault that somehow managed to be both concerning and adorable. Before any human could react, Artemis was there, gently collecting her adventurous daughter and carrying her back to the nest. "That's good maternal behavior," Abigail noted, her tone softening slightly. "She's attentive and protective, which is promising." She sighed, professional caution warring with pragmatism. "I'm sending a team tomorrow to assess the situation in person. In the meantime, continue minimizing human interaction beyond essential care." After the call ended, Elena noticed Samuel's pensive expression. "What are you thinking?" "That Dr. Morrison raises valid points about Artemis's unusual behavior," he replied. "But I wonder if we're applying the wrong framework. We keep thinking in binary terms, wild versus domesticated, when perhaps there's another category altogether." "What do you mean?" Thomas asked. "Throughout human history, certain animals have chosen to form bonds with humans that defy simple classification. Not pets, not completely wild, but something more like partners." Samuel's gaze returned to Artemis, who met his eyes with that unsettling intelligence. What if Artemis represents something similar? A bobcat that maintains her essential nature, while also recognizing a connection with specific humans? This philosophical discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Patricia Gomez, accompanied by a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit whom Elena recognized as Henry Blackwood, chairman of the hospital board. "Dr. Rivera, Dr. Reyes," Patricia began formally, "I'd like to introduce Chairman Blackwood, who requested a first-hand look at our unique situation." Henry Blackwood stepped forward, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene. The recovering stroke patient, the elderly forest ranger, the bobcat and her kits in their makeshift nest, and the exhausted doctor who had overseen this unprecedented situation. "Dr. Rivera," he said finally, "I've known you for 15 years, and I've never fully understood your dual dedication to surgery and wildlife rehabilitation. I always thought they were separate passions." His gaze moved to Artemis. "I'm beginning to see they might be connected in ways none of us appreciated." "They are indeed, Henry," Samuel replied, the familiar address indicating their long association. "Both involve healing, both require patience and respect for natural processes, and both occasionally present mysteries that humble our scientific understanding." Henry's professional reserve softened slightly. "The press coverage has been extraordinary. Donations to the hospital foundation have increased tenfold since this morning, with donors specifically mentioning the Bobcat story. The board held an emergency session an hour ago." He paused, allowing the significance of this statement to register. Hospital board emergency sessions typically meant trouble, budget crises, litigation threats, or leadership changes. Elena tensed, preparing for bad news. "We've unanimously approved the establishment of the Mercy General Wildlife Medicine Initiative," Henry continued, surprising them all. "A new department focused on the intersection of human and animal health, with emphasis on conservation medicine and rehabilitation." Samuel straightened, his expression brightening with interest. "That's unexpected." "The initial funding is secured through donations generated by your story," Henry explained. "Corporate sponsors are already contacting us, eager to associate their brands with what the public is calling the miracle of Mercy General." Patricia stepped forward. "We'd like you to serve as the initiative's director once you've recovered, Dr. Rivera. Your unique background in both human medicine and wildlife rehabilitation makes you ideally suited for the role." The smallest Kit had wandered back to the barrier, watching the newcomers with evident curiosity. As if sensing the significance of the moment, she sat up on her hind legs, her tiny form perfectly silhouetted against the hospital room light. A photographer, who had been quietly documenting the scene for the hospital's records, captured the image. A newborn wild animal, born against all odds in the most clinical of environments, displaying the innate curiosity that connected all living creatures. The photograph would later become the logo for the Mercy General Wildlife Medicine Initiative, symbolizing the unexpected bridge between human medicine and wildlife conservation that had formed in room 8 of the ICU. 3 days after Artemis's dramatic arrival, Mercy General had settled into a new rhythm around its unusual residents. The initial media frenzy had evolved into a steady stream of carefully managed updates, with the hospital's newly expanded public relations team controlling access and messaging. The hallway outside Samuel's room had been converted into an impromptu observation area where approved visitors, primarily medical students, wildlife specialists, and select journalists, could observe the Bobcat family through a specially designed viewing window. For Elena, who had finally been ordered home for proper rest after nearly 72 hours on duty, returning to the hospital felt like entering a different world. The ICU, typically a place of hushed voices and medical urgency, now buzzed with an energy she had never experienced in her years of practice. Staff members who normally maintained professional distance found themselves exchanging stories about Artemis and her kits, their clinical detachment softened by the undeniable wonder of what was unfolding in room 8. The night shift named them, Michael informed her as they reviewed patient charts at the nurses' station. The staff held a vote. Elena raised an eyebrow. Named the kits, without consulting Dr. Rivera? Actually, it was his idea, Michael explained. He said it would help the staff feel more connected to their care. The names are provisional, of course, until they're moved to a more permanent facility. So what are they called? Elena asked, curious despite her attempt to maintain professional distance. Michael's face broke into a rare smile. The 3 larger ones are Luna, Orion, and Willow, keeping with the nature theme of their mother's name. And the smallest one, the fighter who needed resuscitation. He paused, his expression softening. They named her Mercy. Elena felt an unexpected tightness in her throat. There was something perfect about that name for the tiny kit who had defied death in their ICU, who had tumbled fearlessly across Patricia Gomez's shoes and charmed the hospital board chairman. Mercy, she repeated softly. It fits her. As she approached Samuel's room, Elena noted the increased security presence, a necessary precaution given the public interest and the value now attached to the Bobcat family. A wildlife specialist from the State Conservation Department stood beside the regular hospital security officer, both checking credentials carefully before allowing access to the observation area. Through the viewing window, Elena could see that the room had been further modified to better accommodate its unusual occupants. The harsh fluorescent lighting had been replaced with softer illumination that mimicked natural daylight cycles. The floor space had been reconfigured to create a larger protected area for Artemis and her kits, with elements of a natural habitat, branches, appropriate bedding materials, and structures that provided both security and enrichment. Samuel sat in a chair beside his bed rather than in it, another remarkable sign of his continued recovery. He was engaged in conversation with Dr. Abigail Morrison from the Wildlife Sanctuary, who had arrived the previous day to personally assess the situation. Thomas Whitaker was there as well, looking noticeably improved himself, his oxygen support reduced to an as-needed basis rather than continuous. Elena entered after a brief knock, the security protocols waived for her as Samuel's primary physician. All 3 occupants looked up at her arrival, their conversation pausing. Dr. Reyes, Abigail greeted her. We were just discussing transition plans for Artemis and the kits. Elena moved to check Samuel's vitals. a professional habit, though the monitors showed all readings within normal parameters. I trust you've developed a solution that balances everyone's needs. Actually, Samuel said, we've been developing something more comprehensive than we initially imagined. The Wildlife Medicine Initiative has created new possibilities. Abigail nodded, her initial skepticism apparently moderated by whatever discussions had taken place during Elena's absence. We're proposing a collaborative approach, a purpose-built facility on Dr. Rivera's property that would serve as both a rehabilitation center and a research station focused on wildlife medicine. With proper funding and oversight, Thomas added, his voice stronger than Elena had heard since his admission, it could become a model for integrating conservation, rehabilitation, and medical research. Elena looked toward the Bobcat family, noting how the kits had grown more active in just 3 days. They were exploring their environment with increasing confidence, their movements becoming more coordinated, their distinct personalities emerging. Mercy, the smallest, remained the most adventurous, often venturing farthest from the nest, while her siblings stayed closer to Artemis. The public interest has been extraordinary, Abigail continued. I've never seen anything capture people's imagination quite like this story. It creates an opportunity to educate about wildlife conservation in a way that purely scientific approaches never could. Samuel's expression grew more serious. But it also creates a responsibility. We need to ensure that Artemis and her kits don't become mere symbols or entertainment. Their well-being and natural development remain the priority. As they spoke, a nurse entered with Samuel's lunch tray, moving carefully to avoid disturbing Artemis. The Bobcat watched attentively, but showed no signs of stress at the human presence. When the nurse left, Samuel began eating with normal appetite, yet another sign of his remarkable recovery. Your improvement continues to defy explanation, Elena observed, reviewing his latest test results on her tablet. Your neurological function is nearly normal, your muscle strength is returning far faster than typical post-stroke recovery, and your cognitive assessments show no significant deficits. Samuel glanced toward Artemis, who seemed to meet his gaze with understanding. I've been thinking about that, he said, about the mechanism behind what's happening. And? Elena prompted, genuinely curious about his perspective as both a medical doctor and someone experiencing this unprecedented recovery. The purring, he said simply. Feline purring occurs at frequencies between 25 and 150 hertz, exactly the range shown to promote tissue healing and reduce inflammation in multiple studies. Therapeutic ultrasound uses similar frequencies. Abigail leaned forward with interest. There's research suggesting that purring evolved not just as a social signal but as a self-healing mechanism. Cats purr when injured or in distress, potentially to accelerate their own recovery. Artemis has been purring almost constantly since she arrived, Thomas noted, especially when she's near Samuel's bed. Elena considered this. The explanation was plausible from a physical standpoint. Vibrational therapy had recognized medical applications, but it didn't account for the full range of what had occurred. Artemis finding Samuel in the first place, the timing of her labor, the apparent communication between them during the critical moments of the fourth kit's birth. That might explain some of the physical improvement, she acknowledged, but not everything we've witnessed. Samuel smiled slightly. Science begins with observable phenomena, then searches for explanations. Sometimes those explanations take generations to discover. Think of how many medical practices were considered miraculous before we understood the underlying mechanisms. Their philosophical discussion was interrupted by a soft alert from the monitors tracking the Bobcat family's vitals, a precautionary system installed by the wildlife team. Nothing concerning, just an indication of increased activity. Mercy had once again separated from her siblings and was attempting to climb one of the branches that had been installed along the edge of their enclosure. The tiny kit made it halfway up before losing her grip and tumbling backward. Unlike her previous falls, however, this one ended with a graceless landing that appeared to twist her front paw. A high-pitched cry of distress filled the room, the first vocalization any of the kits had made loud enough to be clearly audible to the humans. Artemis immediately responded, moving toward her injured daughter, but something unexpected happened before she reached Mercy. Samuel, without conscious thought or hesitation, also moved toward the barrier separating the human and animal spaces, an instinctive response to the kit's distress. As both mother and human reached toward the injured kit, Artemis paused, her amber eyes meeting Samuel's with an intensity that silenced everyone in the room. For a breathless moment, no one moved. Then, in a gesture that defied conventional wildlife behavior, Artemis gently nudged her injured daughter toward the barrier, toward Samuel. "Is she asking for your help?" Abigail whispered, professional skepticism temporarily abandoned in the face of what they were witnessing. Samuel nodded slowly, his expression reflecting wonder and responsibility in equal measure. "I think she is." With careful movements, Samuel opened the small access panel that the wildlife team had installed for necessary interventions. Artemis remained perfectly still, watching as he gently reached toward Mercy. The injured kit, still whimpering softly, made no attempt to retreat from his approaching hands. "This goes against everything we know about wild animal behavior," Abigail murmured, her scientific mind struggling to reconcile what she was witnessing with established wildlife principles. Elena moved closer, medical instincts taking over. "The paw might be sprained. She'll need immobilization and possibly pain management appropriate for her size and species." Samuel lifted Mercy with practiced gentleness, cradling the tiny creature in his palms. The kit immediately quieted, her distressed cries subsiding to soft, hiccuping sounds that tugged at the hearts of everyone present. With methodical care, Samuel examined the injured paw, his surgeon's hands delicate in their assessment. "Minor sprain, I think," he concluded. "No broken bones that I can detect." He looked to Abigail. "Do you have pediatric veterinary splints in your kit?" She nodded, retrieving a small case from her medical bag. "I brought a full range of emergency supplies just in case." What followed was an extraordinary collaboration between human and Bobcat. Samuel, with Elena and Abigail's assistance, carefully splinted Mercy's tiny paw, while Artemis watched from just inches away, her calm presence seemingly reassuring her daughter. The other three kits gathered at the barrier, their small faces pressed against the partition as they observed this strange interaction. "I've never seen anything like this," Abigail admitted as Samuel finished securing the miniature splint. "Wild mothers typically become aggressive when humans handle their young, even ones with prior human contact. Perhaps we need to reconsider our definitions of wild," Thomas suggested quietly. "Maybe there are gradations, connections we haven't fully understood." When the treatment was complete, Samuel held Mercy up for a final inspection. The kit blinked at him with what almost looked like gratitude, then turned toward her mother with a tiny mew. Without hesitation, Samuel extended his hands through the access panel, offering the injured kit back to Artemis. The Bobcat approached, gently took her daughter by the scruff of the neck and carried her back to the nest. What happened next caused even Abigail, with all her professional detachment, to gasp softly. Artemis returned to the barrier, looked directly at Samuel, and pressed her forehead briefly against the panel separating them, a gesture of such clear trust and acknowledgement that words became unnecessary. "Thank you," Samuel whispered, though whether Artemis could understand the words was less relevant than the connection they represented. News of the injured kit and Samuel's intervention spread quickly through the hospital. Staff members who had been maintaining professional distance found themselves drawn to the observation window, watching as Artemis tended to Mercy with maternal dedication, occasionally glancing toward Samuel as if confirming his continued presence. 2 weeks later, on a clear spring morning, a small procession made its way from Mercy General to Samuel's property at the edge of the national forest. The carefully planned relocation of Artemis and her kits had become something of a community event, with police escorts clearing the route and onlookers lining the streets to catch a glimpse of the Bobcat family that had captured national attention. The specialized transport vehicle moved slowly, minimizing stress on its precious cargo. Inside, Artemis and her kits traveled in a custom-designed enclosure that allowed them to remain together while ensuring their safety. Samuel, now discharged from the hospital and continuing his remarkable recovery, rode alongside them, his presence providing a consistent reassurance throughout the journey. At the destination, a transformation awaited. Samuel's modest cabin had been expanded during his hospital stay, with a state-of-the-art wildlife rehabilitation facility constructed adjacent to the original structure. Funded by the overwhelming donations that had poured in following the miracle of Mercy General, the facility represented the first physical manifestation of the Wildlife Medicine Initiative. Elena stood with Thomas Whitaker, Patricia Gomez, and a small group of hospital staff who had been granted the privilege of witnessing the Bobcat family's transition to their new home. The rehabilitation enclosure was a marvel of thoughtful design, spacious enough to allow natural behaviors while providing the protection the young family would need until the kits were ready for a more independent life. "It's perfect," Elena said, surveying the natural features, climbing structures, and secure perimeter that would serve as a temporary home until the kits were old enough for the next phase of their journey back to the wild. "Not entirely wild, not fully captive," Thomas observed. "A middle path, like Artemis herself." Samuel supervised the final preparations, his movements showing only the slightest hint of the stroke that had nearly claimed his life. When everything was ready, he personally opened the transport carrier, stepping back to allow Artemis to emerge on her own terms. The Bobcat paused at the threshold, surveying her new surroundings with careful assessment. Behind her, 4 curious faces peered out, Luna, Orion, and Willow crowding together, while Mercy, her splint now removed and her paw fully healed, pushed forward with characteristic determination. For a tense moment, no one breathed. Then Artemis stepped confidently into the enclosure, her kits following close behind. They began exploring immediately, the 3 larger kits staying near their mother, while Mercy, true to her nature, ventured farther afield, testing her recovered paw with playful bounds. "They're home," Samuel said simply, his voice thick with emotion. 6 months later, Mercy General Hospital held a ceremony to officially inaugurate the Wildlife Medicine Initiative. The hospital atrium had been transformed for the occasion, with the centerpiece being a life-sized bronze sculpture of Artemis and her 4 kits, a permanent commemoration of the extraordinary events that had catalyzed the program. The audience included hospital staff, community members, conservation officials, and representatives from wildlife organizations across the country. Samuel, now fully recovered and serving as the initiative's director, stood at the podium, his presence commanding in a way that transcended his medical achievements. "What began in room 8 of our ICU has evolved into something none of us could have predicted," he began, surveying the assembled crowd. "A new understanding of the connections between human medicine and wildlife conservation, between healing and habitat, between scientific knowledge and the mysteries that still surround us." Elena sat in the front row beside Thomas Whitaker, whose own recovery had progressed remarkably. The retired ranger had become a key advisor to the initiative, his decades of field experience providing practical wisdom to complement the medical expertise. "Today we formalize what Artemis taught us," Samuel continued, "that the boundaries between species are more permeable than we once believed, that healing transcends the limitations of our understanding, and that sometimes the most profound medical advances begin with moments of inexplicable connection. On the large screen behind him appeared a recent image, Artemis and her kits in their enclosure at Samuel's property. The 4 young bobcats had grown significantly, their kittenish appearance giving way to the more defined features of adolescent bobcats. Mercy, still the smallest but no longer fragile, was captured mid-leap between branches, her injured paw showing no lasting effects from her early accident. Next month, we will begin the process of transitioning Artemis and her family to the larger habitat that will prepare them for eventual release, Samuel explained. They will be the first residents of the Wildwood Corridor, that protected pathway between conservation lands that will ensure future generations of wildlife can thrive in connected ecosystems. As the ceremony concluded and the audience rose in standing ovation, Elena found herself reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that had begun with a pregnant bobcat somehow finding her way into the ICU. What had initially seemed impossible, a wild animal navigating a complex building to locate a specific human, had evolved into something even more remarkable, a transformation of how an entire community viewed its relationship with the natural world. The bronze sculpture would remain in the hospital atrium, a daily reminder to patients, visitors, and staff of the bobcat who had entered their clinical world and changed it forever. But the true memorial was more profound. It lived in the Wildlife Medicine Initiative in the protected Wildwood Corridor, in Samuel's renewed purpose, and in the tears that had flowed freely throughout Mercy General when a wild creature had demonstrated a connection that defied scientific explanation, but resonated with something deeply human in everyone who witnessed it. As visitors gathered around the sculpture, many reaching out to touch the bronze representation of tiny Mercy with her splinted paw, Elena overheard a young nurse explaining to a new patient, "That's the pregnant bobcat that entered our ICU last spring." What she did next made the whole hospital cry. It was, Elena reflected, the perfect summation of a story that continued to unfold in ways that no one could have predicted, a story of boundaries crossed, connections formed, and healing that extended far beyond the walls of Mercy General to touch something essential about the relationship between humans and the wild world that surrounded them.